It was the summer of 2023, and I desperately needed a break. Work had been incredibly stressful, and I hadn't taken a proper vacation in over a year. When my friend Sarah suggested a weekend getaway to a quaint, isolated Airbnb in the mountains, it sounded like the perfect escape. The listing described a charming rustic cabin nestled deep in the woods, promising peace, tranquility, and a much-needed respite from the chaos of city life. On August 18th, Sarah, her boyfriend Mark and I packed our bags and set off for what we thought would be a relaxing retreat. The drive took longer than expected. The cabin was situated far off the main roads, and we had to navigate a series of narrow, winding paths that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin itself looked exactly as advertised, a picturesque wooden structure with a wraparound porch surrounded by towering pine trees. The air was fresh and the silence was almost eerie. There were no other houses or people in sight, just the dense woods stretching out in every direction. We unloaded our bags and settled in. The interior was cozy, with rustic decor and a stone fireplace that gave it a warm, inviting feel. We were thrilled to find that the cabin had all the modern amenities we needed, including a fully stocked kitchen and comfortable bedrooms. After unpacking, we decided to explore the area. There was a small creek nearby, and we spent some time wandering through the forest, enjoying the beauty and solitude. As evening approached, we returned to the cabin and prepared dinner. We cooked a hearty meal, laughing and reminiscing about old times. The atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful, and any lingering stress from the city quickly melted away. After dinner, we lit a fire in the fireplace and settled into the living room, sipping wine and chatting late into the night. It was close to midnight when we finally decided to call it a night. Sarah and Mark took the master bedroom, while I settled into the guest room. The bed was comfortable and I drifted off to sleep almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, however, I woke up to an odd sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or perhaps a tree branch brushing against the cabin, but as I lay there, the tapping grew louder and more insistent. I got out of bed and walked down the dark hallway to investigate. The cabin was eerily quiet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The tapping seemed to be coming from the living room. As I approached, I noticed that the fire had gone out, leaving the room in near total darkness. I switched on a lamp, but the tapping stopped abruptly. I stood there for a moment, listening intently, but the noise didn't return. Feeling uneasy, I went back to bed and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I mentioned the tapping to Sarah and Mark, but they shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably just the wind. We spent the day hiking and exploring the surrounding area, trying to ignore the strange occurrences of the previous night. However, when we returned to the cabin that evening, things took a darker turn. As we were preparing dinner, the lights began to flicker. At first, we thought it was a problem with the electrical system, but the flickering became more pronounced and seemed almost deliberate. Sarah went to check the circuit breaker, but everything appeared to be in order. Then the tapping started again, louder this time and more persistent. It echoed through the cabin, sending shivers down my spine. Mark suggested that we might have a rodent problem and set out some traps, but none of us really believed that was the cause. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It felt oppressive, like we were being watched. We tried to shake off our unease and enjoy the rest of the evening, but the mood was decidedly tense. That night, the disturbances escalated. I woke again to the sound of tapping, but this time it was accompanied by whispers, faint, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably human. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was menacing. I got up and crept through the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dim light, I could see the faint outline of a figure standing by the fireplace. It was just a shadow, barely visible, but it was there, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. I decided to check the basement, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange noises. The basement was musty and filled with old furniture and boxes. As I sifted through the clutter, I found an old journal tucked away in a dusty corner. It belonged to the previous owner of the cabin, a man named Richard who had lived there in the 1950s. His entries started off mundane, detailing daily life in the woods, but as I read on, the tone grew increasingly desperate. Richard wrote about strange noises and sightings, describing a presence that seemed to haunt the cabin. He spoke of nightmares and an overwhelming sense of dread that consumed him. His final entry was dated March 13th, 1958. He wrote about seeing a shadowy figure and hearing whispers in the night. The last line sent chills down my spine. I fear I am not alone. I shared my discovery with Sarah and Mark the next morning. We were all thoroughly spooked, but leaving the cabin wasn't an option. The nearest town was miles away, and we had no cell service. We decided to stick it out, hoping that the disturbances were just the product of our imaginations. That evening, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. The tapping grew more aggressive, and objects in the cabin began to move on their own. A chair slid across the floor, and the kitchen cabinets banged open and shut. The air grew cold, and a sense of malevolence filled the cabin. Sarah was the first to see it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest just visible through the window. She screamed and we all rushed to look, but by the time we got there, it was gone. We huddled together, terrified and unsure of what to do. The figure appeared again, closer this time, its outline barely visible in the dark. It seemed to be watching us, waiting. That night, none of us slept. We sat in the living room, keeping watch, the journal open on the table in front of us. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the temperature dropped further. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, and the shadowy figure stepped inside. It was tall and indistinct, its form shifting and changing. Its eyes glowed with a sinister light, and it moved toward us with a deliberate, menacing gait. We backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out, and the room was filled with a blinding light. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was a struggle, and I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my arm. The whispers were deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt a surge of panic and desperation as the figure closed in. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed the journal and began reading aloud from Richard's final entry. The figure recoiled, and the whispers grew even louder, almost unbearable. The light intensified, and the cabin shook violently. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The figure vanished, and the whispers ceased. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed our things and fled the cabin, driving through the night until we reached the nearest town. Exhausted and shaken, we checked into a motel and collapsed into bed. The next morning, we reported our experience to the local authorities, but they were skeptical. There had been no other reports of paranormal activity in the area, and they dismissed our story as a figment of our imagination. We returned home, but the experience haunted us. None of us could shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something truly evil. Sarah and Mark broke up shortly after the trip, and our friendship never quite recovered. As for me, I still have nightmares about that cabin and the shadowy figure that haunted it. Years later, I did some research and discovered that the cabin had a long history of strange occurrences. It had changed hands multiple times, and every owner reported similar disturbances. The locals spoke of a curse, but no one knew its origin. To this day, I can't explain what happened during our stay at the cabin. All I know is that something was there, something dark and malevolent. And even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for its next victim.